Alright, so Silksong has been out for about a month now, and after around 50 hours of devouring something that some of us have been waiting upwards of 8 years for, I think it's safe to say that the game's pretty good, isn't it? Silksong is gorgeous, it's got loads of cool surprises, it's got great combat, and it's even got this good girl. All things that make it well worth the near decade of development time it took to finally finish, and also all of that silk sanity that was slowly taking over the internet for a bit back there. I can say with absolute confidence that some of Silksong's amazingly designed boss fights, its cool lore reveals, and its incredible hidden areas that, don't worry, I won't spoil, I'm only going to be talking about things from Act 1 in this video, are going to be among some of my favourite gaming moments of the year, as I, let's be honest, sort of expected they would be. But the one thing about Silksong that I don't think anyone expected was for a single part of the game to end up standing out above all the others. For one teeny tiny strand of Silksong to become more memorable, emotionally evocative, and dare I say, controversial than anything else in the entire game. What am I obliquely referring to? Well, of course, I'm talking about an otherwise unsuspecting early game area by a name you might recognise, and that name is Hunter's March. Now, for people who might not be familiar or who have suppressed their trauma from that place, Hunter's March is the zone that can be located just off the top of the Marrows, which is the first real area of the game. And in comparison to that place, which is filled with nice simple bony boys, Hunter's March represents, and I'm going to use a technical term here, a completely absurd difficulty spike. It's got some really punishing platforming filled with spike traps, it's got some really tough enemies like these guys with 1,000,000 health, these ones that you can't hit, and these ones which make the already tricky bouncing even harder, and that's not even considering the zone's guardian boss who wiped me so many times that I lost count. The place is hard, really hard. And as you might expect, this has caused a lot of people from both casual and professional sides of the gaming world to come out and say that Hunter's March, as well as a couple of other problem parts of Silksong, are way too hard and much too punishing. And while from a certain perspective these people definitely have a point, in spite of all that complaining I just laid on you, I'm not entirely sure I agree. Don't get the wrong idea, Silksong is a tough game, and even though, yes, I did manage to beat the true ending and all of these problem bosses without breaking too much of a sweat. Oh my god, oh wow, oh you shouldn't have. A trophy for me? Wow! I'm not about to say that the game is too easy, and that everyone who had trouble needs to get good or go back to playing Kirby's Epic Yarn. However, I am going to say that I think the root cause of some of people's more frustrating Silksong experiences and the Achilles heel of an otherwise fantastic game goes a little bit deeper than it just being a bit overtuned in the difficulty department. I think, rather than Silksong being too hard and punishing even when you're doing everything right, I think instead that Silksong is all too easy for us to play wrong. Alright, back up, that sounds confusing, doesn't it? Essentially, what I mean is that while Silksong is absolutely a pretty challenging game, and while it does a perfectly fine job of teaching you the controls, it does a much sloppier job of teaching players how to think about the various problems it presents them with. And that leads to people playing the game in a way that doesn't make full use of their toolkit and getting trapped in patterns of behaviour that make the game less fun. To show you what I'm talking about here, take my, and I'm sure several other people's experience, fighting the Savage Beastfly, one of the major denizens of Hunter's March. Because the boss fight is in a spooky, intimidating temple that required a new skill to access and represented yet another difficulty spike, I became under the impression that it was a mandatory barrier to progression, and that meant that I felt I had no other option than to keep trying to beat it, even though it was really hard and I only had 5 measly hit points. Furthermore, whenever I died to the Savage Beastfly, which was pretty often, I would be forced to run all the way through Bug Vietnam back from the Marrows, a truly monumental trip, because I was under the impression that the only bench in Hunter's March wasn't actually a bench at all, it was a trap. A series of frustrating experiences compounded by the fact that in Silksong, much like in other Souls-inspired titles, you drop all your precious rosaries when you die, meaning that I felt compelled to keep fighting the boss rather than retreating and exploring elsewhere, because if I did, I would lose out on a bunch of cash, locking me in this endless, torturous cycle of running through an area I didn't want to be in to fight a boss I knew was too hard, only to die, and felt that I had no choice but to do it all over again. These 3 assumptions, that I A, had to fight the Savage Beastfly, that B, Hunter's March had no respawn points, and C, that I couldn't afford to not go back and pick up my corpse, were taught to me through my experiences with the game, and led to me playing in a way that wasn't much fun, only for me to later learn that each of these assumptions were, not to put too fine of a point on it, completely wrong, and that I'd actually been, through no fault of my own, playing the game incorrectly. Firstly, you really don't have to worry about rosaries that much in the early game. They're very easy to come by later on, and all the stuff that you actually need to pay for, like Bellway entrances, are very affordable. Second, you can actually fix the Hunter's March bench. It's really easy if you know where to look, and it cuts the run back to the Savage Beast fight in slightly more than half. And thirdly, the Savage Beast fight isn't even mandatory at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure you can roll credits without so much as stepping into Hunter's March to begin with. 3 kind of important pieces of information that the game doesn't really make much of an effort to teach you. What this means is that, in essence, Silksong taught me how to play incorrectly. It has systems and gameplay concepts that appear to punish exploration and experimentation, when in reality, they're fundamental to any good player's success. And I started to not just find the game much easier when I abandoned my intuition and started to run away from fights I found too hard to go and do something else, but I was able to appreciate the game's brilliantly designed world and its really well-paced difficulty once I started playing in the way I was supposed to be doing the entire time. Basically, what I'm talking about here is the idea that video games can be engaged with incorrectly. They're possible to play wrong, and unless you're going to count reading a book backwards starting from the middle, that makes them pretty unique. There are key gameplay lessons that games need to teach us that go beyond mechanical interaction. If we're not taught how to respond to obstacles and how to approach certain gameplay concepts in the right way, then we end up not interfacing with the game as well as we could be, and having a bad time as a result. And Silksong, which I must stress is a great game that I really like, is a very clear example of how important it can be to get this stuff right, and how disastrous it can be when this hidden aspect of teaching goes wrong. And so, to demonstrate my point and to highlight what I think is an underappreciated part of the design of our favourite games, what I want to do is to talk about some of the hidden ways that our favourite titles are able to condition us to play in certain ways without us ever really noticing, and why some other games that seem on the surface like they've done everything right actually end up being frustrating and confusing, because while they've succeeded in teaching us how to play, they've failed to teach us how to think. To give a dead simple non-Silksong example of how all this works, we need only look at fast-paced shooters like Doom, Ultra Kill, RoboQuest, and a few others. These games want to be about intense, high-risk engagements, where you feel awesome for surviving on the skin of your teeth, and so the mechanics are designed to promote that kind of thinking and that style of play. By limiting healing to only being available when you're close to enemies or when they get hurt or die, and making changes that penalise long-range damage and reward being quick instead of methodical, these games condition players to not fear taking damage so long as they can come out ahead once an enemy dies, and to treat staying in constant motion to be a more effective defensive posture than staying in cover. My favourite example of this, by the way, is RoboQuest's little grinder bots. They only appear at the very start of each fight, and they drop a huge payout of health and EXP, but they disappear after a few seconds. This makes the most profitable way to fight to dive in before you've even gotten a chance to scan the battlefield, making things super chaotic and super fun. You absolutely can play all these games in a very static, defensive, and safe way. It's certainly not impossible, but due to the way their systems are designed and the way they introduce key mechanics so as to form positive associations between aggression and success, you'll naturally fall into perceiving enemies and arenas through the intended high-octane perspective, and thus respond to situations in a way that makes the most fun use of the mechanics. When you learn how to spot it, this kind of subtle shaping of our perspective is everywhere in games that feel suspiciously intuitive and smooth to play. It's not that we just so happen to be super smart and instantly understand how these games work, it's that we're being subconsciously conditioned into perceiving situations and mechanics in particular ways, shaping our decision making, and as a result, our overall experiences. Donkey Kong Bonanza stops you from spending the entire game underground by using its early levels to teach you that staying on the surface is usually a quicker and more profitable way to get where you are going. Hades and its sequel trick you into doing your between-run chores not just every single time, but also in a particular order, by positioning them in convenient places relative to the fastest route back to the real game. The reason why StarCraft 2's campaign is so good is because it gradually trains you to do more than just spam Marines or Zerglings in every mission, by making each one a showcase of a particular unit, both teaching you their function and teaching you to respond to threats with specific counters rather than a generic one-size-fits-all response. Of course, in addition to positive reinforcement, disincentivizing players doing the wrong thing is also a valid way of teaching us what to do, so long as it's done with a sufficiently light touch. Survival horror games get us paranoid about efficiency because even though they usually have systems to prevent us totally running out of ammo, the threat alone is enough to change how we play for the better. Many fighting games stop you from spamming certain moves by making them lose damage the more you use them, forcing you to switch things up and play in a more interesting way in order to succeed. And well-designed Dota-style games scale the payout of farming methods based on their level of interactivity with other players, and thus their level of fun. Hiding alone in the jungle is boring, so it pays out the least, whereas fighting other players and taking objectives is where the best gameplay is, so that stuff gets rewarded the most. And as a personal favourite, Consume Me, a game about, amongst other things, having an eating disorder, uses our natural desire to optimise statistics to trick us into making choices that we never would have of our own free will, like punishing Jenny with exercise whenever she breaks her diet to get her back under the threshold, or juicing your stats by doing stuff like reading diet magazines to increase your fullness without actually eating. It is brilliantly effective how long it takes you to realise the person the game is slowly making you become. And that's the power of this sort of conditioning. None of these intuitively designed games ever directly enforce their intended playstyle or sit the player down and explain, right, here's what you're supposed to be doing. Because not only would that spoil the fun, it'd be less effective as a teaching tool. Instead, they leverage the human brain's incredible capacity for internalizing complex systems by making the psychological path of least resistance also the way the developers want you to view the game and think about the mechanics. This is important to do, because while our brains are great at making connections and building an understanding of systems, there's no guarantee that we'll interpret the mechanics in the way that we're supposed to. And once that we've locked ourselves into an incorrect interpretation of the game's mechanics and intended playstyle, it can be very difficult to fix that misapprehension. Blueprints, one of my other favourite games of this year, is very guilty of not taking this into account. See, the game is structured like a roguelike, so many players naturally assume that if they plough through enough random setups, eventually they'll be able to reach room 46. But the reality is that it's much more important to understand Mount Holy's hidden rules and solve its puzzles, which don't change from run to run, than it is to try and get good room draws on a single day. Something that is very frustrating to deal with if you think the game works more like a mainstream roguelike, where you can expect to get measurably further with each attempt. To briefly go back to Silksong, it makes a real tactical error here. Many players critically underuse the tools mechanic in the game, and as a result find fighting to be less interesting and more difficult than it could be, because they've decided not to use an entire facet of the combat system. Why is this? Well, it's twofold. Early in the game, not only is the tool you're most likely to discover first, this one, the straight pin, kind of terrible, but using it consumes shards, a resource that you need a lot of to complete an early game quest. This not only lends itself to the conclusion that you should be hoarding shards instead of spending them on tool uses, just in case there's another quest, but it also dissuades you against using tools in general, because the only ones you're likely to get during the early game are just more expensive, less powerful versions of the Silk Spear ability, which also does horizontal range damage. It's just actually good. Both of these assumptions are of course false. Shards are everywhere and the later game tools are really powerful, but once the assumption is set in, it's that much more difficult to unlearn. As an aside here, Claire Obscure Expedition 33, weirdly another contender for Game of the Year, manages to sidestep these exact sorts of problems by being very clear with what it wants players to do right from the outset. Claire Obscure Expedition 33's very first upgrade, or Picto, is this one, which gives you action points for perfect dodging enemy attacks. This is an absurdly powerful ability, and one that serves as a not-so-subtle nudge in the right direction to treat dodging stuff as their default response, rather than expecting to just be able to tank or heal their way through enemy attacks like in most role-playing games. If this ability were simply part of the default toolkit, then the players that most need to make this connection would never see it. But by making it feel like you're optimizing your play by exploiting a powerful ability, you internalize the lesson that much more effectively. Of course, incentivizing particular behaviors and disincentivizing others is only half the battle when it comes to making sure we play games correctly. Developers also need to make sure to open lines of communication and make sure we're able to read and interpret the information being delivered to us effectively. One of the easiest ways to show you what I mean here is with Metroidvanias. The whole appeal of this genre lies in exploration, but equally, nobody likes getting lost or feeling like they can't find out where to go in order to progress. Luckily, each upgrade in a Metroidvania, be it a double jump, or the ability to turn into a fart, or just a new kind of beam, can help you work out where to go simply by serving as a navigational cue to return to an obstacle that you previously couldn't deal with, and thus a new area to explore. And the best Metroidvanias teach us this navigational language as clearly as they can. To Silksong's credit for a change, it actually does this really well. Stuff like these rings or these gusts of wind are nice memorable landmarks to know to come back to later when you get the relevant upgrade. And the game even goes out of its way to teach you other nice bits of navigational signposting, like the fact that Shaq with the map vendor is always nearby when you hear a song and see her stupid donut weapons lying around. For a more old-school take on the same ideas, many platformers use an association with collectibles to drag you through the intended routes. It can be difficult to figure out where you're supposed to be going while you're travelling at super speed in a Sonic game, and it's surprisingly easy to get lost in some of Mario's 3D adventures. But by orienting yourself around the idea that rings and coins are always worth grabbing, you'll almost always find yourself on the intended, smoothest level trajectory. Other games can even do this as well, like how Pipistrello and the Cursed Yo-Yo uses lines of cash to illustrate unconventional ricochet angles that you may not have considered on your first glance, which massively cuts down down on frustration and leads to way less downtime doing yo-yo ballistics maths. It's not just what games tell us that establishes the foundational patterns of the way we play though. How games communicate information to us can have just as large of an effect on the way we end up perceiving a game, and thus the way we end up playing it, as what lessons they try to get across. Many games, for example, use the pressure of a clock to get us thinking about resource management and optimizing our limited time. Everything from Majora's Mask to Minute would be way less fun without that time pressure to give our decisions context and inform the way that we're supposed to be playing. However, games that introduce timers via a big doomsday clock right at the start are going to inform the way we play very differently compared to games that treat time more as a suggestion. Titles like Dead Rising or Unsighted keep players under stress and constantly focused on the mission because there is no escape from their big countdown, establishing a mindset that you should be squeezing every last bit of efficiency out of every bit of gameplay. A very stressful way to play, to the point that many players get put off games entirely at the mere suggestion of these kinds of limits. Conversely, a more slow-rolled, low-key time limit, like in Stardew Valley or Persona, puts the emphasis much more on getting players to choose what activities or people matter the most and to have fun scheduling their day. A much more accessible presentation, in spite of the fact that many of these games' time limits are no less strict. All it takes is motivating us through fear or self-expression for us to view optimal play very differently, and thus having two very different kinds of experience. Whether it's by subtly telling us stuff or incentivizing particular patterns of play, games are constantly talking with us, and our understanding of how they work and what we're supposed to be doing is always changing. But this relationship doesn't end on the mechanical level. Every aspect of our play is shaped by the lessons we draw from the things we experience and the things that we haven't experienced. The way games react when we get stuck or fail is a very obvious way that games condition us to behave in particular ways beyond the context of their mechanics. For example, Bennett Foddy's Baby Steps, a very tricky game, teaches us that messing up isn't a huge deal by setting a bunch of what are essentially traps for us that send us sliding humiliatingly down the mountain, but immediately softening the blow with a funny cutscene, helping to establish the lesson that not only are all those weird-looking, out-of-the-way places worth going to because they might have more cutscenes, but also that falling down is unavoidable, and so you don't need to treat it as a personal failure. On the other hand, games with permanent stakes for messing up push us to avoid failure by any means possible. As I mentioned earlier, the prospect of losing cash when you die in a Souls-like game all but forces you to keep trying bosses over and over until you win, something that helps emphasize the game's pattern recognition gameplay, but conversely de-emphasizes trying to think your way around problems because there's a permanent consequence to messing it up. On that subject, it's just as critical for games to teach us what is and is not possible within their confines, because the only thing that feels worse than interpreting a game's structure incorrectly is finding out that some important mechanic or area that would have made the game much more fun was an option the whole time, but you had no idea that it even existed. The excellent horror RPG Look Outside deals with this really well. The game is, naturally, being a horror title, all about feeling alone and overwhelmed. But this presents a potential issue. Players can't know whether the monsters they're up against feel dangerous because it's a survival horror game, or because they're just in the wrong area, getting owned by high-level stuff they're not meant to be fighting yet. And also, because the game is all about being trapped in an apartment complex filled with scary monsters, they might not realise that some of said monsters are actually friendly and are recruitable party members, and thus spend the entire game outnumbered. Look Outside fixes both of these issues very cleverly without ever undermining its core themes. Firstly, it never tells players where they're supposed to go, but it does give them a cryptic warning if they're fighting stuff that's too tough, letting you gradually triangulate the intended progression path based on what doesn't give you a warning. And if you are getting beaten up and need to spend more time at home recuperating, that gives you a much greater chance of encountering random visitors who are almost always helpful and around half the time will happily join your squad as a party member, both helping you out and cluing you into the fact that party members are even a mechanic, even if said party members are these horrible goth children. The incomparable Outer Wilds also uses its design to define the scope of a player's exploration without ever spoiling the actual fun. In Outer Wilds, you never need to wander around blindly because each clue, such as these message boards, serves as a series of breadcrumb trails linking to several other avenues of exploration, quickly teaching you that if you ever get lost, all you need to do is retrace your steps to find the next path to progress. And there's no need to worry if you're missing anything, because this handy "there's more to explore" reminder is always there to nudge you in the direction of anything you've yet to see, not giving the game away, but instead empowering us to go and explore for ourselves. This is in stark contrast to some of Silksong's biggest stumbling blocks in the form of bosses like Morwing, who was so mean Team Cherry even had to issue a rare nerf, and the Last Judge, who has a particularly awful runback. Both of these Act 1 menaces are actually completely optional, but the players who would most benefit from this information will never find out. Just like in the case of Outer Wilds, a hint to players that there's somewhere else they could be exploring wouldn't be bailing out players who are worse at the game, letting them know there's a fun quest quest to do to get rid of Morwing, or a whole new adventure to go on to bypass the last judge, it's just letting them play the game as intended, exploring around to new places and using their brains to bypass problems rather than endless attempts at the same fight. Plus, it's gonna be much less frustrating dealing with this bastard on the last judge run back if you know that you don't have to be doing this, and that if you're getting too frustrated, you can just go and seek out the other option instead, who is, in my opinion, much easier, more fun, and more relevant to the plot, making it a real shame that so few people even know Phantom exists. I guess what I'm saying is, to get to the meat of this, and to give Silksong, which, again, is arguably my game of the year, a bit of a break, is that we as a gaming audience tend to overestimate our independence in the world of games, and underestimate our responsibility to make sure they work. The interactive nature of video games is a canvas for our self-expression and a display of our agency, but the experience of playing a game isn't something that we can create alone. Before we've ever started playing, someone else has laid out our tools and defined the boundaries of our control, and without knowing what our silent partner's intent was, that unknown would always be working against us instead of allowing us to truly flex our creative muscles. So, I think rather than assuming implicitly that however we've chosen to perceive and strategize around a game's systems is automatically the best, most optimal, and funnest way to play, we should always be questioning whether there might be a better way, and whether the developers have been trying to tell us something that we've been missing the whole time. There have been loads of games over the years that I thought were terrible and that everyone else was totally wrong about, until I realised that I was actually the one playing them wrong. And with a little change of perspective on my part, I was finally able to see what the devs were going for and have much more fun as a result. I decided not to bother parrying anything in Metal Gear Rising because I thought it was too hard, and as a result I died a bunch to attacks that I should have been able to block, and I had way less fun chopping up enemies, which is easiest to activate after a parry. I initially didn't get why people love Death Stranding so much, because I thought the cutscenes were boring, and that slowly delivering one package at a time across easy terrain was pretty monotonous. But all that changed once I realised the reason why there's all sorts of lost packages all over the place and all kinds of traversal equipment is that the real fun comes from delivering the heaviest loads as fast as you can. Pause for a laugh, which turns the tedious walking around into these fantastic endurance odysseys. And even in the case of Silksong, I was one of those people who thought that Team Cherry had let everyone down and that they were washed after just their second game, until I stopped mashing my face against bosses that were too hard and started exploring off the beaten path, finding cool routes around problem areas that I didn't want to deal with, and experimenting with systems that I'd initially written off as not worth using. And the more I opened my mind to what the game was trying to do, as opposed to what I expected it to be, the more fun I had. And that's what makes it such a shame that it's so hard to get what Silksong is trying to do on your first go, and why it's so important to treat games, like all art, as a constantly evolving conversation between the developers and players, not a static monolith that could never change. So, in the spirit of this video, if there's a game out there that you didn't enjoy, but you can't escape the nagging feeling that you might have been playing it wrong, I highly recommend going back and giving it another go with a fresh perspective. Who knows, maybe all it's going to take to turn a disappointment into a new favourite is a different point of view, for you to try a new strategy, to go to a different place, or to stop doing things that simply aren't fun. Because, take it from me, you don't have to fight the Savage Beastfly if you really don't want to. He'll just be there, in Hunter's March, chilling until you're ready, leaving you free to get on with the rest of the really fun no, they promised he would just be an Hunter's March! No, oh god, no! Hello friends, and welcome to the After the Video segment, that part of every video where I get on my hands and knees and beg you to hit the like button, dingle the bell, subscribe to the channel, and sacrifice a goat in the name of the YouTube gods, or whatever animal it is that they're interested in most right now. Seriously, it means a lot. It's also the time and place where I point you in the direction of some cool people that you should be made aware of, and this time, it's NoClip 2. Wait, I hear you say? NoClip is already a very big YouTube channel, and you're right, but NoClip 2 is a new spin-off endeavour from the same team, which is all about indie games, industry previews, and all the cool things that games media used to produce, but abandoned in favour of more profitable and more boring things instead. Basically, all the stuff I like. Needless to say, the quality on display here is incredible, and the NoClip team have used their industry reach and contacts to secure some pretty amazing early offerings, like a massive look at Mugenics, the new game from Edmund Macmillan, which I am salivating over and cannot wait to get my hands on. If that, or any of the other things they've got on offer interest you, then please do check them out, and continue to support independent games media, because God knows, do we need the help right now. But some people who absolutely don't need any help because they're already awesome are my wonderful, fantastic supporters, both the old, venerable Patreon patrons and the newfangled YouTube member Vanguard. Both groups help to keep this channel operating and give me the peace of mind I need to make these videos good rather than quickly. I took the time out of this one to rewrite some sections of this video to make them less boring and more factually accurate, and I wouldn't have felt okay doing that if I was crippled by the pressure to release things as fast as possible. And it means a whole lot that people are willing to support videos like this and think that they're worth the money. Of course, this whole thing isn't just a one-sided deal. If you support the channel, you'll get earlier access to videos, extra bonus behind-the-scenes content, occasional update videos where I share my most secret, salacious thoughts, and, you know what's coming next, your name in the credits. $5 a month gets you credited in text form, and $10 a month gets you on the special voiced shoutout list alongside these fine people, who are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Auna94, Bobby, Brian Notariani, Konstantin Amend, Cosmic360, Daniel Metjes, Daniel Ursin, Dirk Jan Karrenbeld, Digletier, Dis Ellie, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fullabaxi, Furious Hulk, Gazkull, How, Hecate Noah, I Support Trans Rights, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Konlov, Kangi, Luke Kokoran, Mace54, Maxim Filipov, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Michael C, Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Raudkull, Reddedex, Regal Regex, Seslux, Silver Folfy, Tyler Duncan, Timoteus Begsack, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brantmeyer, Zach Brantmaras, the name mimicer's reign of terror continues, I see, and ciao. Okay, that's all from me for now. I will see you next time. Bye!